Yeah. So we can just start with we usually start with just a very short meditation, then we'll meditate a little as we go along, I think, through the text, but just for a brief meditation to start with, let's just, I think what will be useful, we usually meditate on our motivation, so last class we were talking about the Four Noble Truths, actually. And so in the context of motivation, so truth, we were I'll start with the first, just briefly, if we remember it, the first noble truth is that, that there is suffering, right? Dukkha, or unsatisfied, um, sense that one's situation is not completely satisfactory, right? That one's subject to suffering. And here we can think, you know, that's true for me, and it's equally true for others. Mm. So just as I want to be happy and free from suffering, which is normal, healthy, and so also does everyone else. And so here we start to develop a sense of compassion for ourselves and also for others. And so I and others are subject, first of all, to just suffering, we call the suffering of suffering, right? Ordinary pain, anxiety, fear, loss, and everyone else, right? Strangers, friends, enemies are subject to those same kinds of suffering. Things change instant by instant, our bodies and our minds. Think of yourself and think of yourself like, which we are actually, right? We're surrounded by all other beings. You know, our lives and their lives are interconnected. And we're all subject to this kind of utter uncertainty. And as we're thinking of ourselves and others, we can also bring to mind the cause of suffering, which is ultimately ignorance about the nature of oneself, right? And then all the mental afflictions, greed, hatred, arrogance, pride, jealousy, anger, and so on, right? All these different mental afflictions. And so we ourselves and all other sentient beings are subject, right? We're controlled by different mental afflictions, totally under the control of ignorance Yeah. So if we look, each of us looks at ourselves and others, we can see actually, right, that although we don't want suffering, we create the causes of suffering for ourselves and others. Although we want happiness, we don't. We're often ignorant, right, and don't create the causes of happiness for ourselves and for others. So here we start to cultivate a compassion. May I be able to free myself from ignorance and the mental afflictions, my confusion about the nature of reality, so that I can be of help to others, to help them, because we're all the same. We're all subject to these kinds of causes of suffering and problems. So then the motivation, right, is compassion. May I free myself from suffering and its causes. May I free others from suffering and its causes. And so, compassion, right? Bodhicitta is the wish to achieve enlightenment, to be a benefit to all beings. So with that kind of you know, thought in mind, I'll just once recite the verse of refuge in Bodhicitta. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened, the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfection, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. We'll do a little more meditation in a minute, but so it said that we're gonna this start now on what are called the 37 harmonies with enlightenment, which is the main topic of this whole series of classes from chapter 4 of the Abhisamaya, or the Ornament for Clear Realizations. But anyway, these start with the four close placements of mind, and and those were taught by the Buddha himself, right? I mean, all these 37 topics were taught by the Buddha, but these four close placements of mindfulness were taught over and over by the Buddha in many different, many times. They were often taught, and and so they're the first four of the 37. Um, and so I just thought we'll go over. And sometimes they're called the four close placements of mindfulness, or sometimes they're called the four foundations. It's just different translations, like close placement or foundation of mindfulness. Um, and I'll say, first of all, so obviously mindfulness is part of the four close placements of mindfulness, but it's not, a close placement of mindfulness is a special kind of mindfulness. It's not, so it's not the same. If you just say, I'm going to practice mindfulness, that's not identical to saying I'm going to practice one of the four close placements of mindfulness. Um, and so, well, actually, I'll read the definition of a close placement of mindfulness, according to this text we're studying, and then we'll kind of talk about it and sort of to make sure we understand what a close placement of mindfulness is. So in the text, it's defined in this text, it's defined as an exalted knower of one who has entered the path, which is included within either mindfulness or wisdom that meditates on the four bodies, feelings, minds, and phenomena through examining the specific and general characteristics of each of them. So it's a little bit of a complicated definition, right? Um, but let's go through this. I want to go kind of slowly through it. So first of all, mindfulness, right? Like that's the most basic term here. Um, and in Buddhist psychology, right, in the Buddhist psychological teachings, actually mindfulness and wisdom, I want to go over each are defined. I don't know. I prefer intelligence for this word. There's a various words. I always think that's funny, you know. And I've often thought this actually in our actually, first of all, in our culture, I find that like wisdom isn't talked about all that much. Um, Whereas in Buddhism, of course, it's the main focus. And then there are many different words. That's what one part I was getting at. Is there are many different words in Tibetan for wisdom that they try and control. You know, because we don't have that many, because we don't talk about it as much. We don't have as many nuanced terms to differentiate like different kinds of wisdom, say, which is fun to think about, right? What kinds of wisdom are are you developing? And there are all kinds of wisdom. Buddhism, many, many different kinds. But anyway, we'll get into what's getting gotten at here. But first of all, so mindfulness. We're in in the four close placements of mindfulness. In Buddhist psychology, mindfulness has a definition also, which is um, where it means. So mindfulness is in Buddhist psychology is defined as something that where you bring to mind a familiar object, something you've known about before or seen before or experienced before, and then you they say non-forgetfulness or non-distraction from that object, so you keep the mind not distracted away from that object. um, so that's the definition of mindfulness, right? So if I mean, a common practice, right, is the breath. We're all familiar with the breath, so then that's a familiar object, and if you keep your mind on the breath, not forgetting the breath, not distracted from the breath, that would be mindfulness of the breath, right? um, or they sometimes talk about well, actually we're doing it, right? Mindfulness of and feelings, right? You're familiar with a feeling of pleasure or displeasure, right? So you would bring that to mind, and then you're staying aware of it. You're not letting the mind drift away from it or become distracted from it or forget it. um, so you can see, like, actually, mindfulness in Buddhist psychology is actually something. Anytime you're really, you know, the story. Anytime you're saying, so in that sense, the mental factor of mindfulness could be there. Um, Actually, it's not. So for one point is it's not particularly a virtuous or non-virtuous mind, actually, right? Like, whereas if somebody's like, I remember what was my teacher, Buddhist Lama Zopa actually said, he pointed out, he said, actually, a thief can be quite mindful, right? They're like very mindful of their plan, and they're breaking in, and he said, like, and the thief is very mindful as they're moving because they don't want to get caught. He said that's not a virtuous process, of course. And he said so mindfulness is just this thing of like kind of staying aware and not forgetting and not sort of getting distracted from what your object of mind is, right? What your object of attention is, maybe the better way to say it. So that so that's mindfulness, right? That's not, and then that's one part of the close placement of mindfulness. But obviously, that alone is not a close placement of mindfulness, because a thief who's being mindful of robbing is not practicing a close placement of mindfulness. Um, and then the way actually, I'm going to read a quote from His Holiness the Dalai Lama. He says, the close placement of mindfulness, or the establishment of mindfulness in this context of the four close placements of mindfulness, means to place our mindfulness on an object comprehended by wisdom. So here it's combining mindfulness with a kind of wisdom. And in this context, I'll actually say that sometimes you'll meet Tibetans named Sherab, actually, or it's a name. Sometimes people have that name. But this is that Tibetan word, Sherab. And that particular, sometimes that mental factor is called wisdom, translated as wisdom, sometimes as intelligence. There are different ways to translate that word, sure, but maybe intelligence, I think it gets it a little more for me in English, but you can decide for yourself which word captures this. I often think this. It's useful actually to look at how does a word get defined in these inner, because the purpose of these terms is for introspection, right? Is to be aware of it in yourself, right? Am I actually being mindful? So you have to know what is mindfulness. Then you can see, am I being mindful or not? But if you don't know what it is, then you can't. So just saying the word mindfulness actually isn't. You have to be able to kind of go, okay, it's a familiar object, and you're keeping your mind there, right? So then, if I'm distracted, I'm not being mindful, right? You know that then because you know what it is. So this thing, wisdom here, is it's an first of all, it's a mental factor that helps us ascertain something, and this also can be virtuous or non-virtuous. So this is why I say wisdom is a little funny to me because for me, wisdom has a positive connotation. So I'm going to call it intelligence, right? Um, and intelligence can be a good or a bad thing, right? Because like if you're being intelligent and conning somebody, that's not a good thing, right? Or something like that. If you're being intelligent and hurting another person, that's not positive. Um, so what this guy, I'm going to call it intelligence. So what this does is it's a mental factor that I'm going to read it here that strongly differentiates qualities of things being examined. It functions to overcome doubt. It examines the faults and the good qualities of a thing in order to understand the nature of that thing, right? And so I would call that intelligence more than wisdom, personally. Wisdom to me implies kind of something deeper than that. But but different translates translate different ways, right? But so it's a mind that's kind of what's the word? Uh, examining something and determining what's good and what's bad about it. Yeah.
So I was gonna say, is that like analytical?
It could be like I'm going to give a worldly simple example. That's why I'm calling it intelligence, right? Like if somebody is saying like somebody who's really into cars, I'm giving you some totally unrelated to Buddhism for a second, right? If somebody's totally into cars, right, and they might say, oh, this car has these good features, and it has these advantages over another car. It gets better gas mileage, and it's more reliable, and it has this kind of engine and this kind of other features, right? There, in that case, it's strongly differentiating the qualities of the thing, right? It's a kind of intelligence that's strongly differentiating the qualities of that thing by looking at what's good and what's bad about it. So it could be that. Now, of course, in the Buddhist context, that's not. I mean, that is a kind of intelligence, but it's not a spiritually significant kind of intelligence. Um, so a spiritually significant kind of intelligence would be doing the same thing with regards to, say, one's own. If you're, I'll give now a more Buddhist example, right? Where somebody is, say um, they're going to interact with somebody, right? And they pause and they think, "Oh, I'm going towards this person and I'm annoyed at them. Is that going to lead to a good result or a bad result? Let me check. Let me discern that." And then they check, right? And they analyze. Wow, if I go towards that person with annoyance, that's going to create a conflict. Then I'm going to first of all create bad karma. I'm going to be harsh towards them. They're going to be harsh back towards me. That's going to lead to further conflict. It's going to cause suffering for myself, suffering for this other person. So they're analyzing. Oh, those are the bad qualities. If I were to get pause and take some breaths and think through, you know, say come to a more compassionate attitude, maybe that will lead to a better interaction, at least for me, maybe also for them. So that's a kind of intelligence discerning. You see what I'm getting at, or examining. So one is a worldly, everyday, whatever external example, another is a more internal example. But that's what this mental factor is. Does that sort of get it?
Mhm. Yeah.
And the mindfulness would be where you're holding your mind to that discernment then, right? And here's the thing and this is not yet a close placement on but this would be at least mindfulness with wisdom, right? With this kind of is, let's say the person, I'm going to give an example now of how you have to combine mindfulness and that kind of wisdom. I'm going to use the one I just did, right, where the person's going towards somebody with annoyance, right? This happens all the time, isn't it? Where the person might think that and then think, yeah, but they did this, and then they forget what they were just thinking about, and they go and they start an argument with their spouse or their friend or whoever, right? They maybe did a little discerning, right, or wisdom or intelligence about it, but they didn't keep mindful of it, right? So mindfulness is where you keep your mind on it, right? So you recognize, okay, if I like, so you're discerning, right? You're examining. Oh, if I go towards this person with my annoyance, I'm going to create conflict. If I go towards them with a little bit more kindness, it's going to lead to a better result. Now let me stay mindful of that insight. I gained an insight. Let me hold my mind to that. Let me keep my mind on that. And then they stop, right? Think, okay, that's where I want to hold my awareness. And then as I'm taking each step towards them, I'm holding my awareness on, let me stay with kindness. Let me not fall into um, aggression or something. And then they actually start speaking, but as they're speaking, they're keeping their mindfulness on. Let me speak with kindness. So then they would be practicing a mindfulness that's combined. Going back to what Dalai Lama said, right? Mindfulness on an object comprehended by wisdom. So I'm just giving a sort of everyday example, right? So if the person had a certain, and this is wisdom or intelligence, I don't know, whatever you want to call that, right? But a kind of understanding through having examined that it'd be better to approach the person with kindness than aggression. And then it's holding that mindfulness of that while you're having the conversation. And then let's say the person says something a little provocative, right? The temptation would be for your mind to jump away from that mindfulness and fall back into losing track of it. But mindfulness would be saying, no, let me keep my mind on this. This was a hard earned awareness that I'd rather be kind than aggressive. Let me hold my mind. Let me keep my mind on that. As the Dalai Lama said, on that wisdom or that comprehension. So that would be like an example of in everyday life of how you would not yet have found close foundation of mindfulness, but it would be that would be the example of mindfulness combined with wisdom, with or intelligence in this sense. Does that get at it? Um, yeah, I do call this one intelligent because this thing of discerning the good and bad qualities, first of all, it can be mistaken. It's on this, they call it mistaken. That's why the mistaken cherub, or something they call it cherub or something. There are mistaken cherubs and there are good, correct ones. And also, there are also neutral ones, right? Like, that don't have any particular, like karmically neutral ones where just somebody's discerning this kind of whatever, this is the correct kind of bolt for this screw in this um,
Right.
chair. That's a true discernment, but it's a true intelligence or true understanding, but doesn't have any spiritual significance in the sense of
It's worldly dharma.
progress. Yeah, it's worldly, exactly. Worldly, exactly. So does that okay? So that those are those two terms. Does that make sense? So as Tony Stalama said, right? So it's a kind of mindfulness that keeps the mind on a not forgetting or a non-distraction from something that has been comprehended by a kind of intelligence or wisdom about that topic. Um, you're starting to get the sense of what a close. This is just the beginning, but now there's another couple more points. Then it says it's an exalted knower of one who has entered the path, right? So what does that mean? Now I want to say something here about this. This is important from a practical perspective. We all of us, um, all of us, actually, the only way you progress to the path is by practicing mindfulness combined with the kind of wisdom that we just described, right? And all of us can do that thing, right? Like I'm about to be aggressive. Let me pause. Let me reflect on that. Let me approach this person with kindness. Or all of us can think about, for example, the nature of suffering and the First Noble Truth, right? We can contemplate that. Anybody can contemplate that. So we all practice those, but they only become a close placement of mindfulness. They only rise to that level when you enter the path. So what does that mean? And in this text, they don't. It says it can be. I've said this before, but I just want to kind of explain it because what does it mean to have entered the path, right? Um, so there are many different things, right? You can be. I mean, I went over it one other time the five paths, right? So it means actually technically it means first I'll say for those who are familiar with the term, technically it means you've at least entered the path of accumulation in the technical sense in the Buddhist path systems. But but I guess I'll say it this way. Okay, so regarding Buddhist practices, right? First of all, anybody can practice any Buddhist practice they want, right? And Buddhism is not very. You don't have to be Buddhist. You don't have to, just practice. In other words, if there's a practice of compassion that you like, do it. If you don't like it, you don't have to do it. That's that. Right? That's the general Buddhist stance, right? And any moment of practicing, say, love is a good thing, right? but it's not a path somewhere. It's a good thing to do, right? It's a kind of healthy mind. It's a mind, love is a loving kindness that cherishes others is a good thing. Um, but it's not a path towards a specific goal in Buddhism. It's just a good state of mind. Um, then there's like something where they say sometimes they'll point out like if you're doing something just where you're motivated, so this is getting at motivation actually. If you're doing that, then that's a good thing, but it's not a path. Then according to according to Buddhist teachings, if you're you have to say this, if you're doing something just to be comfortable in this life, right, then that's actually not that's fine. That's up to you. It's like it's not a prison, but they'll say that's not a spiritual practice. That's not a dharma practice. That's just what anybody does. Like so you're eating lunch or you're going to work, and if your motivation for going to work is to make enough money so that you can have whatever something later, that's fine. But obviously that's not a Buddhist practice and it's not a spiritual practice. It's just something you're doing, right? And then they'll say same thing if you're practicing mindfulness of breathing because you want to be healthy and have less stress. That's fine. That's a good thing, but that's not a spiritual practice. That's same as like exercising or whatever. So those are all fine things to do, but they're not. But then so then they call it like a minimum level of motivation where you've kind of doing something where your motivation is genuinely something they say beyond this life is the way they sometimes put it, right? Something so like and they say the minimum level of that is trying to have a better future lives, right? But like whatever, have a better future lifetime. Then they say that's a Dharma practice, but that's not yet a path either, actually, which is interesting, isn't it? Because that's fine, but it's similar. Actually, they'll just say like that's similar to trying to if you're working now to have like a good retirement, well, that's good, it's fine, but it's not a spiritual practice. And if you're working just to have like a good future rebirth and go to heaven or something like that, that's also fine, but that's not spiritual practice in the sense of it's not a path. And it is a spiritual practice. I'm sorry, that could be a spiritual practice, it's not a path. A path means to a final goal. That makes sense. To some kind of ultimate goal. And so, according to Buddhism, there's the path of the cures or Shravakas, there's a path of the Prajika Buddhas, and there's a path of Bodhisattvas. Um, but so, okay, so when it says I had to explain all this, say one who has entered a path, what does that mean? So what it means is it's a person who either if it's they're on the path um, to individual liberation, it means that the person's main motivation, the main way they motivate themselves day in and day out, is seeking liberation from samsara. And so that the person, when they wake up in the morning, when they're going about their day, and when they're doing a practice, their main wish is, may I be free from samsara, free from suffering and its causes. And so they've developed what they call the mind of definite emergence, which is sometimes translated as the mind of renunciation, right? For liberation. And so that person is on a path towards liberation, right? And they're seeking liberation. And when that person practices now mindfulness combined with wisdom, it becomes a close placement of mindfulness. The other kind of path is the path of the bodhisattva, right, which is a path towards full enlightenment, right? A path towards Buddhahood, motivated by great compassion, wishing to liberate and benefit all mother sentient beings throughout space. So a person who has that motivation has entered a path, right? A path to full enlightenment, a path to Buddhahood. So that's definitely so. And one point they make is we can at first, everybody, if you're interested in entering the path, at first you create those motivations um, through contemplating, right, through effort, right? So if you're thinking about like liberation, even I was saying, I was sharing this recently. I was reading about the Dalai Lama's own experience, where he said at a certain age when he was young, he started thinking about the nature of liberation, right? And he was like studying about that, thinking about it, and he was like, as he was reading about the nature of liberation, he thought, I'd really like to achieve that. Wow, that sounds quite wonderful. He was a young person. He was like, that seems like a good goal. Suffering is quite difficult. Liberation from suffering would be wonderful. He read what liberation would be like from suffering, and he thought that sounds quite good. And he started developing a strong feeling, right? Like I want to. So we all have to do that. Even, my point is, if even the Dalai Lama had to do that when he was young, it's not, it doesn't happen just like rain falling for no, like randomly. You cultivate it. And at first it's kind of comes about through cultivation. And eventually you become habituated to that state of mind and it becomes normal to you, right? And it becomes like your normal baseline way of living. And by the way, we all do that, right? We all create baseline motivations. If you grow up in a culture where you think, like, where people say, oh, what's important is being richer than your neighbors, and everybody's doing that, and you think about that a lot, you might become very motivated and work day and night to try to be richer than your neighbors, right? And it's just like whatever you get habituated to becomes your motivation. It's not some mysterious, like miraculous thing, right? Here, you're cultivating a particular kind of baseline motivation, which is the wish for liberation. And then the other is bodhicitta, right? The wish to benefit all mother sentient beings or all beings throughout, out of great love and great compassion. And again, you could just habituate to that and then you could realize it, right? But it becomes your baseline motivation, just like the other person might have the baseline motivation of being richer than somebody else or whatever, or having more power than somebody. All those are just whatever you want to habituate your mind to, right? So these are particular. So the person who's entered the path, though, is somebody who's habituated their mind to the point where that's their normal everyday motivation, is this wish either for liberation or for enlightenment. Okay, it's a lot just to explain what is a close placement of mindfulness, right? So now you get the sense, right? So it's an exalted knower, right? Means like a marvelous state of awareness, right? In such a person who's entered a path where they now, so then they practice mindfulness, focusing on, not forgetting, not distracting from something their wisdom or their intelligence has discerned, right? You get the idea there. Then it says, going back to, I would finish the definition, that's the main point. But then it says that meditates on the four. Right? So there are four bases. And once the person is going to do that, they can be mindful of of bodies, right? Form, of feelings, of minds, or of phenomena. And by the way, those four include everything. So you can include any, but those are four categories the Buddha taught um, for various reasons we'll discuss. But the Buddha taught those four categories as things to practice mindfulness of. And then it says examining the specific and general characteristics of each. And so we'll get into what are those. Right? But that's what you examine, because remember we said you have a kind of wisdom or intelligence that examines something. What are you examining? The general and the specific characteristics of those four things. Um, any questions now about? Oh, John has a question. So pause now and accept questions just about what is the five. Four. Now at least we know what are the four foundations. We defined it, right? John, go ahead.
Yeah, this is quick just to clarify because I was wondering about that, whatever is being translated as exalted knower. And I was guessing that it was referring to an Arya, so they're not at this point. Okay, so I was thinking if that were the case, that it's signifying that it's a person who's actually reached the path of seeing. But what is
No,
it
in this
being translated? It's exalted. It's not what we typically translate as noble, right?
No, here an exalted knower is a synonym for a path. So it's a mind, it's a mental state, right? And in Buddhism, path is a mind, is a mental knower. It's a mind, right? It's a mental state. So here it's an exalted knower in this definition is a synonym for a path or a synonym for a clear realization. And so I'll give an example, like just to get, so it doesn't mean an Arya because somebody on the path of accumulation, the very first who has just entered the path, would have an exalted knower. So if that person is thinking about impermanence, for example, so a person who's just entered, let's say they've just developed bodhicitta, right? So they're on the path in that sense. They have bodhicitta, the compassionate wish to achieve enlightenment for all beings. And then they're sitting and just thinking, being mindful of impermanence and recognizing all things that are produced by cause and conditions are impermanent. That would be an example of an exalted knower that's a path, and that actually is one of the four close places of mindfulness. Then, right there, if they're recognizing that truth, so that would be an example. So it's a knower in the mind of a person who's entered the path. So like an exalted knower here means an awareness of someone who's entered the path. So exalted in this context implies has entered a path.
So it kind of signifies that the person is spiritually motivated as opposed to just worldly concerns.
Well, actually, even beyond that, though, it is because there it's because it's also beyond the. If you think of Lamrim, like the stages of the path, uh, there are three levels of motivation. The first is for good future rebirth. This they're not yet on a path, so that wouldn't be they wouldn't be included in this. So it's a person who at least has the wish for liberation from samsara itself. So they have to have at least that level of motivation, and then they're with that motivation, which makes it exalted, they're being aware of some aspect of
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
something related to practice. Yeah. So that's what the words exalted implies on a path. Though, if that makes sense in this context, not an aria, but just on the path. Um, okay. Any other questions? Yeah.
It's still useful if we have not fully entered a path. It's still useful for us to explore the placement of mindfulness and those practices, even though we haven't perhaps completely entered a path yet.
Great question. I think, and I think a key point here is that actually the only way to enter a path is to practice the 4 spaces of mindfulness. So we have to actually, it's like if you're interested in, so if you're thinking, oh, I'd like to enter the path, one of the Buddhist paths, or practice the path, then we have to practice the 4 close places of mindfulness in order to do so. And or we have to practice we could call them approximations of the 4, because we're not yet fully able to practice until you enter the path. It's not technically it doesn't technically fit the definition of being a close placement of mindfulness as one of the 37 harmonies of enlightenment. But it's how we get to that point. So we have to practice it. Yeah, so if you're interested in practice, you're supposed to do that. You have to do that. It's the only way to progress to that. And as you practice what I would call like an approximation of the 4 close placements of mindfulness, then eventually it becomes an actual close placement of mindfulness. So we have to, yeah, it's the only way to progress, actually.
It's like, I mean, so like the practices and learning and reading, I mean, it's all developing the habit, right? I mean, over time, at first, when you first learn how to meditate, your mind wanders a lot. And, it might take you 5 minutes to realize your mind's wandering. Like, oh, bring it back, bring it back. But you keep doing it, and it becomes like maybe you realize it in 30 seconds, maybe 10 seconds, and it takes over time. People always ask me about this stuff, and I always said, it's like going to the gym. Like when you go to the gym, like, the first time you don't want to go and it hurts and you're not doing it right anyway. But over time, eventually it becomes a lot easier and you can do more and more and more. But it takes effort to develop those habits. And so seeing the teaching today kind of ingrained that in me. Is like, it's not just going to happen like that.
No, I always think, the Tibetan word for meditation is gom, right, which actually means habituation or familiarization. It's actually, which is interesting, right? Technically, I mean, if you like etymologically, and we translate it often as meditation, because it's when you say it's a correct translation, but really the connotation of that Tibetan word is more like developing a habit. So it's exactly what you're saying.
Sure. Yeah, we're so used to not really paying attention to just having our minds operate on autopilot, the monkey mind, as they call it, right? And like it takes effort to like get used to watching it.
So much, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I always think that it's also besides meditation, also catching yourself in those instances where you would get irritated and antagonistic, and then catching yourself and saying, oh, there's a better way of dealing. And it doesn't always happen, but the more, I have an example from my law practice. We talked to a client who was fired, there was discrimination, and the associate on the call really didn't like the client. So she starts talking, and the client starts talking about this game that they played called Finding Hitler, which was with someone who's, it was horrifying to me. And apparently someone whose parents or grandparents had been killed in the Holocaust injected, and that led to a big scandal. And I thought, this is horrifying that anybody does it. And then the associate pipes up and says, I've done it. I've played that game. And I was just like, who is this person? So I calmed down after it and went and talked to her about it. And I don't know if I had an effect, but I sort of felt better about the interaction, talking to her as opposed to blowing up and saying, why are you working here? You know? So it's like catching myself on those kind of situations, trying to, how do you say it, deal with them better. So it's like a form of habituation. That's where I see it. I mean, meditation I see is okay, that's a part of it, but it doesn't get you to real life or real life, whatever.
One point I'll just make in relation to one point I'll make in relation to what you're saying is um, even I guess I'll differentiate. Like, there's calm abiding meditation, right, where you're cultivating single pointed concentration, and that you really do have to kind of sit and focus on a certain object, and there's a whole posture you get into, right? Like, that's the context where they really teach, right, the 7 points of your body to be in this posture, and you're trying to stay single pointedly on a certain object. And so that's a certain kind of meditation that really does require quiet context and a sit, especially for people who are starting out, you really do need a kind of certain posture and setting and so on. But actually, meditation, like the term meditation, in at least in the Buddhist context, is not limited to that actually. And you can actually think about it like there is would if you're working and you're about to get actually, well, I'll say this, let's put it this way, Shanti Deva in his guide to the Bodhisattva's way of life, I think he would say, I'm not sure what Shanti Deva would say, but I think he would say, if a person is about to get angry at their coworker and they pause and reflect and then shift to a more patient, he actually used that patient approach, he would say that's a marvelous kind of meditation. So he would call that I think he would call that meditation, actually. It's not calm abiding meditation in the sense that you're not cultivating single pointed concentration, of course, but and sometimes actually in like various teachings, they actually say that's you know a particularly wonderful kind of meditation, and and the Buddha actually, I'll share one more point about that. I don't know if people online could hear, but she was saying, gave an example at work where she was having to practice patience, and the Buddha actually said that for the six perfections, that he said the perfections of generosity, the first three, generosity, ethics, and patience, are particularly important practices and are sort of that people who are living a lay life, that not monastics, those are. And I mean, Ken Rinpoche once said, well, he's a monk, an elder monk and abbot, retired abbot, and he said he was talking to a group of lay students, including myself, and he said, actually, you all have much more opportunity to practice those because first of all, you have more, he said, he's a monk. He doesn't have stuff. So, I mean, he can give Dharma teachings and he can give something, but he doesn't have much to give away because this is it's a very simple. And then he was like, patience, for example, he's like, I'm mostly around other monks or my students, of course, there are opportunities to practice patience, but not day in and day out the way you're describing, right? And he was saying, so the Buddha actually said those practices, especially like have more opportunity and can really make progress. And then the perfections of meditative concentration and wisdom, he said, well, of course, monastics have more opportunity to practice those because if you're living in a kind of quiet monastic setting, there may be more opportunities to develop wisdom. And he said, but of course, monastics have to practice also generosity and patience and ethics, and lay people need to develop concentration. But he was saying, in terms of emphasis, that was a teaching actually came from the Buddha. So I would argue that is a kind of meditation, but it's just not. It's not combining meditation.
It sort of got into your point about situation.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it's habituating your mind to patience in that case.
Do it different.
Yeah. Any other comments or questions before Oh, John has one more.
Yeah, thanks. You know, another clarification, because I appreciated the way you opened it, talking about the distinction between wisdom and intelligence. And, you know, again, you know, given my personal handicap of not knowing Sanskrit and Tibetan, sometimes I'm often wondering how things are translated. And see if you agree with this. I mean, I've been understanding a distinction between prajna and yeshe, and prajna being translated typically as discriminative wisdom, so that that kind of intelligence, you know, which may or may not be wisdom, and yeshe is the what it might be translated as a primordial wisdom of understanding the you know the primordial unity of emptiness and appearance. So when we then talk about prajna paramita, the perfection of this discriminative intelligence or wisdom, I'm thinking maybe that's synonymous with the with Yeshe, with this primordial wisdom of the unity of emptiness and appearance. Does that sound right to you, or?
I'm trying to remember. Actually, think. I think that the what's it called?
Is Yeshe is Sherab the Tibetan for Yeshe? Or?
No, no, Yeshe is also a Tibetan word. That's why, so those are two different Tibetan
Oh,
words. So then there is a prajna is Sanskrit, and it's usually translated wisdom, of course, like the prajna paramita would be the perfection of wisdom, right? Like, but so prajna is a Sanskrit term that's usually translated as wisdom. And then Yeshe and Sherab are two different Tibetan words that are both often translated as wisdom. Um, you know, I usually, it depends on the context though, because like sometimes, anyway, I'm trying to remember. I think Sherab actually, in the context of the Heart Sutra, is what they use to translate prajna there, though. Um, so, but I can't remember how they I can't. I'm just not remembering which Sanskrit word yeshe is a translation of. It's a Tibetan. I can look it up for next time, but I don't remember off the top of my head right now. It might be jhana. Yeah, John. I think it's jhana.
yeah,
So I think usually the Sanskrit term. Uh, I think that's right, but I'll have to look it up to make sure I'm remembering it right. But
yeah. Just personally,
they're
you
two
know,
different. Those both are translated usually. Those two Tibetan terms, yeshe and sherab, are usually both translated as wisdom in English.
yeah, yeah. That's where you know as we get into this progression through the boomies and you know these progressively very subtle states of mental concentration as you advance along the path. I mean, to me, it's very important to understand, you know, what these specific terms mean. You know, what's being translated often is just this big general word of wisdom, you know. So,
No, and I agree. I'll look that up for next time, just to because I'm not remembering exactly which Sanskrit term yeshe is a translation of, but I think it's jhana, but I'm not certain. But in this context, for sure, it's the Tibetan word is sharab, and it's that I prefer intelligence because it can be wrong. Like in other words, in this context, they call it wisdom, and that's fine. But the point is that it's a kind of there in this context, like I said earlier, a person can make a wrong discernment of, or it's examining something and looking at its good and bad qualities, and then coming to a kind of conclusion about it, and then in this context, holding your mindfulness on that conclusion. And it is important to recognize that, though. And of course, in the close places of mindfulness, it's a correct discernment, right, of something. But in ordinary life, which wouldn't be a close place of mindfulness, these kinds of the mental factor of cherub, or which I would call intelligence, it can be a good thing or a bad thing, and it can also be a correct or incorrect discernment about that, or conclusion that you come to. So there are all kinds of examples, right, where people look at something and sort of analyze it and come to a wrong conclusion, and then leads to an unskillful approach to that topic. So, but in the close pace of mind, what we're trying to do, what the practice is actually is using reasoning and using. I mean, in this context, this what we're calling wisdom here is a process of using reasoning and using analysis and using your own experience to correctly analyze or correctly examine things and come to correct understandings of them, and then hold your mindfulness to that correct understanding. Um, that's what you're actually trying to practice in this context. But I'll look up the answer to that question for you next time, just because it's an interesting question. Um, and I want to pause now and say, there's a lot more. Like, I mean, there's tons of stuff about these four close means mindfulness in the text, which we'll go through. But I think it might be useful to slow down for a second and actually give an example, right? Go to a practical practice example for a second. Because I said that you analyze the general and specific characteristics of each of them, right? So I just want to give a very simple, start with a simple one, right? Body. The first of the four objects that's the foundation of mindfulness is bodies, your own. And they say in the if you're practicing for your own individual liberation, your main focus is your own body. If you're practicing the bodhisattva path, it's your own body and the bodies or the form, other external forms as well, meaning also includes, because part of that would be you would be contemplating that, for example, the suffering experience of the bodies of other beings to develop compassion as an example, right? But here let's stick with our own body. It's easier. And so one of the general characteristics of uh, bodies is impermanence, right? And it's general because it's true of not just bodies, but of all they say all conditioned or all things that arise due to causes and conditions are impermanent. And remember, in Buddhism, impermanence, uh, there's a gross level of impermanence, which is like obvious changes. You can break your arm, or you get old, you die eventually, all that. And then there's subtle impermanence, which is it changes instant by instant, right? So, and that's a much subtler level, but it's also true, isn't it? And so, I just want to put like this is where these four close found placements of mindfulness um, are, I think, remarkable and also very extensive. Actually, like in other words, it could seem like a very simple thing, but actually, it's a huge topic, right? So I just want to pause and say, so you know, body is just one of the four objects, right? And then there are many different um, things you can contemplate about a body. But I'm just starting with a very simple one, which is impermanence, right? And so if you were trying to cultivate, so now we're trying to discern, right? So you'd have to do it for yourself, right? Nobody else can do it. This process, we'll share it together a little bit, but you have to analyze in the end for yourself, right? But or examine, right? But actually, like there are many ways countless ways to do this. But let's start with the simple one, right? Which is like, so if you actually start to notice your own body, right? So now you're bringing your mindfulness to a familiar object. Definitely, your own body is a familiar object for you, right? You've been aware of your body before, and actually, let's start with a gross level of impermanence, right? So think about just that, right, in relation to your own body. So you're keeping your mindfulness on your body, and you're recognizing, wow, like in other words, from the time I was born till now, my body has changed uh, in so many ways. Even over the last few years, right? My body has changed in so many ways. Like my body is not a static thing. And so you start to analyze that. Right? That's the wisdom part here, or the intelligence, right? The discernment or the examining. And you start to like analyze that it's in and part of this is you would come until you come to a conclusion. It's in the nature of this body to change. There's nothing I can do, right, that would change that nature because it's this body arose due to causes and conditions. Anything that arises due to causes and conditions has a nature of change. In the case of the body, we sometimes call it aging. And so just notice, right? Can you keep your mindfulness on that? On the just that one factor, right? A discernment or a correct, analysis that my body changes. That is in the very nature of my body to change. That is an absolute certainty this body will continue to change because that's the nature of this body. And then you can bring your awareness even to a subtler level, right? Like if you notice just the breath. Right? In this context, notice like I was thinking about the gross level of change over years. Actually, the process of breathing is a process, continuous change, right? Air coming in, air going out, lungs expanding, contracting. And see if you can just have like through your own examination of your own breathing process, your own sitting and breathing. And take awareness of how the body changes moment by moment. And it's not static. It seems like a body, right? Actually, it's just many processes. Moment by moment change. Even as you sit still, your body isn't completely still. Actually, even the term body, right, is a correct label on a bunch of processes. Air in the room goes into the lungs. Air in the lungs goes back out into the room. The heart is pumping, blood is flowing. Even on the level of the cells, on cellular level, there are countless processes happening. So it's in the nature, right? This thing I call a body, actually, many processes that are in a continuous state of change, of impermanence, momentary change. But just for another moment, see if you can hold your mindfulness to that awareness, right? On a growth level, your body ages and changes, and moment by moment, and the processes in your body are in a continuous state of impermanence. Even to sit up, right? Muscles are adjusting slightly. And so even when we're not focusing on it, digestion is happening. And then we can come back kind of more interactive mode. But I just want to pause because I thought, it could become too abstract. But so that's one, right? That's one. Um, on one hand, first of all, you can see like that is the nature of the body, right? It's impermanent moment by moment. There's nothing. Even you might actually at one point as I was doing that, I was like, as I was sort of analyzing my body, and I thought there was a moment where I was like, well, bones seem more stable, right? Actually, bones are made up of, right? Actually, if you, well, first of all, they also have movement within them, marrow and so on, but also what's it called? The atoms that make up bones, right, are change in the nature of change, right? Um, and so you see the point here is like, so you, uh, you see, get this, I just want to make sure you get a sense experientially of, on the one hand, the factor of mindfulness is where you're holding your aware, you're not letting, if you're, when you're trying to be aware of the body, if your mind suddenly goes to, oh, I forgot to do this for work, you come back, right? If your mind goes to, oh, where am I going to have lunch? You come back. It's in present moment awareness of the topic you're being aware of, in this case, body, right? But then you start to have that wisdom or that intelligence that examines, right? In this case, impermanence, right? So you're being aware of impermanence. You're being aware and you're checking, is it true? And you could say, well, the Buddha said all compounded phenomena are impermanent. But that's what the Buddha said, is my experience. Is my experience of my own body support that or disagree with that? Right? You have to check. And then if you come to a kind of, what was the term Dalai used? If you come to a comprehension, right? That, oh wow, my body's nature is impermanence. Right? And then you hold your mindfulness on that comprehension. Does that make sense? And that's the practice in this context. Is you're holding your awareness and going back to the point about familiarization, right? Now what you're doing is you're allowing your mind to familiarize with an awareness. Oh, the nature of body is impermanence. And you let the mind just become, what's the word? Habituated or familiar with that awareness. You allow that awareness to kind of, yeah, it's familiarization actually with that. That's good. It's a familiarization with that awareness. And that comes through saying mindful of that um, ascertainment that the nature of the body is impermanent. And we're like, I don't know if it was, I said when we were talking about the Four Noble Truths, I said there were 16 aspects of the Four Noble Truths. And actually, the first one was impermanence. The first aspect of the truth of suffering was impermanence. Right? And it said that's an antidote to the Buddha taught, that's an antidote to the view that things are permanent. Right? And so, again, I just want to remind you, like, you know, I don't think any of us walks around saying, oh, I think my body's a permanent, unchanging phenomenon. We don't say that. But what this is getting at is experientially, you start to then, I guess I'll say this way, like, if you do this practice, right, of familiarizing with the awareness of the body's nature is impermanent, and you start to become familiar with it, and then, like, I'll give an example. Like a few months ago, I suddenly got a call from a hospital. Somebody said, "Are you friends with so and so? They're on your list. You're the person on his list. Call." And I went, oh, like I had this immediate, and I was like, "Oh, I didn't," like as if bodies aren't impermanent. And I said, "Oh, okay. Well, where is it?" I said, well, what, how can I come see him? I went to go see my friend. But that moment where I was like, then I thought afterwards, I thought, wow, why did I go? It's like, oh, because I didn't think, you know, um, that's the nature of bodies, you know. And and then I'll share a little short anecdote. I remember, like, because it just is a small reminder. If you check your own awareness, you'll notice there'll be hundreds. And if you start to practice this one, just the awareness of the body is impermanent, you'll start to notice there. At first, you might say, "Well, I don't present the body is permanent." And then, if you suddenly get a pain, or you suddenly have some experience, you go, "What's going on?" Right? You go, "Oh wow, I didn't like. I forgot the body's a bunch of impermanent processes." Right? And then I'll share a story, very short one. But I remember once when I was helping, Reba Rinpoche was one of my teachers and passed away. But anyway, I remember once we were leaving, he would get cancer. And I took him to an oncology appointment, and I brought my car around, and I was with a few other people, and he had just had a whole bunch of chemotherapy, and he was on medication to counteract the side effects. So he was, uh, those medications affect your body, right? So I had wheeled the wheelchair up, or no, somebody else had. I pulled up the car, and I got out of my car. It was my car, so I got out of my car, and I was going around, and somebody else was helping him from the wheelchair into the car, and he started to stand up, and he immediately before I got there, and the other person was there but couldn't catch him, he fell over, and as he was falling, he said something in Tibetan, and I said to I said to the friend, I said, "What did he say as he was falling?" And then they said, he smiled they said as he was falling, he was smiling, and he said, "When you have a body, this is the nature." It's like it was like, wow, even as he was falling down, he was aware that's the nature of bodies. Like no big deal. Like
You have to habituate yourself to for that to be his instinct to comment on that as opposed to like oh shit, like I would have said, oh,
Yeah.
my notes here,
Oh no.
oh no, it's amazing.
So it's a total awareness of that's the nature of bodies. Is my point. He had practiced the foundation of mindfulness of body, as an example. Um, and I guess so. My point is that was just one point, right, of the nature. So meditating on and what you see, yeah, I hope he starts to get a feeling that the goal of all of these, which we're going to get into much more complex points about the four foundations of mindfulness, but is to come to a correct um, comprehension or ascertainment, and then familiarize yourself. Right, that's why I'm glad we came up about meditation, right? And that so it's not just when you're sitting. Going back to your point, right? And you were giving a point about work, but I mean, it's a general point, right? It's not just when you're sitting; it's all the time. It's being holding your awareness to it to what's true about a particular thing, right? Phenomenon as a antidote to some old habit of wrongly understanding something. Yeah, and I'm trying to decide which like there's so many things we could cover, but I'm trying to think. Yeah, maybe I'll share one more point here. We'll get into the specific character. I said the general and specific characteristics, right? Um, so I'll just say what are the general character. I want to cover it maybe for today also. What are the general characteristics? And in Buddhism, there's a very famous teaching that actually there where they say the four seals of Buddhism. And what that is um, it's what makes something. Like actually, they sometimes say there are two ways to determine if you're Buddhist. You know, one is sort of if you take refuge, there's a formal process of kind of a procedural one. If you take refuge in the three jewels, then that's sort of formal. You say that's formally becoming a Buddhist in a sense. But then there's a teaching that says another way of discerning if something's Buddhist or a person's Buddhist or a practice Buddhist is does it conform to the four seals or not? And um and if it does, then it's a Buddhist person or practice or teaching, and if it doesn't, then it's not. And so those four seals are all compounded phenomena. A compounded phenomena means something that arose due to causes and conditions that has parts, right? Or even just that arose due to causes and conditions, are impermanent. So if something arose due to causes and conditions, its nature is impermanence, and it will end also. But it's impermanent even as it exists. The second one is usually it's translated as all contaminated phenomena are suffering, but better contaminated means uh, related to the mental afflictions. Makes sense. So in other words, so contaminated doesn't mean like it's a virus or something, or it means here like if something is connected to craving or grasping or hatred or ignorance, then it's in the nature of suffering. Um, then the third one is uh, all phenomena are empty and selfless, which I can later describe in detail what that each of those terms mean, but empty and selfless. And the last of the four seals is that nirvana is peace. And Sloan often points this out. Those four seals really are unique to Buddhism. Um, and some of those seals are common with other sets of teachings, other views. Uh, but the idea is particularly that all phenomena are empty and selfless, right? That's uniquely Buddhist teaching, actually. Buddha taught that. I guess some Hindu schools would also say nirvana is peace, actually. So that one is actually, I guess it's kind of unique to Indian traditions that it began in India. But anyway, so the general now going back, so those are the four seals of Buddhism. But then the general characteristics that one looks at in relation to the four foundations of mindfulness are impermanence, uh, suffering, right, or dukkha, unsatisfactoriness. Again, it's a translation, right? Suffering is a translation of the Sanskrit term dukkha, which really could be translated as suffering or unsatisfactory. And then empty and selfless. Um, the idea is that, and why are those called general characteristics? It's because they're common, right, across those different um, objects, right? So bodies, feelings, minds, and phenomena. Um, so it's common to those things. And one contemplates those points. And do you see? I hope people are starting to see now. So this practice, the four foundations of mindfulness. I think another general point now is if you've studied Buddhism even a little, you've heard teachings on the Four Noble Truths, right? It's the most foundational teaching of the Buddha. It was the first teaching the Buddha taught in Deer Park after he became enlightened a few while after, right? Um, but it's not, at first we have to hear those teachings on the Four Noble Truths, of course, but the four foundations of mindfulness is the practice of our practices of um, the purpose of, in other words, what I'm saying is you practice them in order to actually personally understand the Four Noble Truths by contemplating your own experience. Does that make sense? So, in other words, when you hear a teaching, oh, there's the truth of suffering and the truth of the cause of suffering and the truth of cessation and the truth of the path, you go, oh, okay, that's the Buddhist teaching. That's what the Buddha taught. But when you're practicing the four foundations of mindfulness, what you're actually doing is now you're looking at your own experience of your body, your bodies. You're looking at your own experience of feelings and so on. And you're analyzing them to see, does my experience tell me that the Four Noble Truths are correct or incorrect? Does that make sense? So now the Four Noble Truths become a matter of personal exploration, not as something you heard from somebody or read in a book, but a matter of what you're exploring in relation to your own experience. Um, so same thing with suffering, right? When you look at the nature of suffering in the context of these four foundations of mindfulness, in particular, right, it's because it's easy, when somebody says suffering in the sense of like if you have back pain on a certain day and you say, oh, that's suffering, well, that's not a mystery and you can pretty easily see it, right? But that's not that's good. It's a good, correct insight, but that's not what causes somebody to enter the path to enlightenment, right? Actually, that probably just gets you to go take a Tylenol or something or go to your doctor. But I mean, but suffering, right? Here you're contemplating suffering in the sense of, is it in the nature of my body, in the nature of my mind, um, the nature of my feelings? So actually, particularly relates to feelings in this context as the cause of suffering. But you're analyzing like, what is the truth of suffering in relation to my own experience? Does that make sense? And I just want to give one small example because then we have to stop in a couple minutes. But um, so contemplating suffering is like it's not as simple as like, oh, I have a pain in my back. I'm gonna use that one as the example for a second, right? So you would analyze, okay, before I had the pain in my back, if I laid in the most comfortable bed I had been in, right? And I lay in one position, so say if I'm tired and I lay down in a certain position, and I think, I feel like some sense of relief, comfort, right? But then if you're analyzing in this way, the four foundations of mindfulness, again, it doesn't have to be sitting. You can do it when you're laying down. You might go, okay, how long can I stay in that exact position before my body starts to become uncomfortable? And you can check your own experience, right? At a certain point, you're going to go, I want to move. I want to turn, right? And then so like you had some discomfort because you were tired and you laid down. You went, oh, you thought, oh, now you felt comfortable, right? And that seemed like a pleasant feeling. But you stay in that position, and at a certain point, you have to turn. Right? And then when you turn your body, you feel some relief. Oh, the suffering of that discomfort of being in the one position ended. Now I'm in a different position. Right. And then if you stay in that position, then you check how long can I stay in that position before there's some discomfort. Right. And so then you start to go, wow, is it the nature of my body that it's not in the nature of the body to be permanently comfortable. And they check, oh, that's true, isn't it? And then like it's kind of like, and you can check, you do the same thing, right? Like if you went to if you or like if you went like people go on vacation like to say a beach or a pool or something, right? And then you go same thing, right? Oh wow, you're in that. If you're in the room and it's cold, you go outside and it's warm, and you sit in a lounge chair. But then first of all, lounge chairs start to get uncomfortable, and also you make it hot. Then you want to go in the water, so you check your own experience, right? Like the most comfortable places. Then of course there are less comfortable places that you can be, like metro, right? And it's like, am I comfortable? Like, and so you check your own experience, right? Like, and you start to go, wow, is the body is it possible for this body to actually experience a kind of static comfort? And it's not possible, right? And then if you check, actually you start to go, oh wow, like even that moment of relief, it's partly a relief of a previous suffering in your, like right in your own experience. You check, you go, well, it is comfortable in that moment, but it's partly because I was uncomfortable, right? Because I was standing too long or I was tired by the time I lay down. And so I'm just giving an example. So you get my point here with suffering. I'm just giving an example, like in relation to the body, you start checking your own experience and going, what is the nature of suffering in relation to my body? It's not just, and then what Buddha is suggesting is, it's not just, it is that you can break your arm and that hurts. That is included. But if you look at the truth of suffering, it's much subtler. It's much more pervasive than that, right? But through mindfulness, I'm just giving an example of mindfulness of the body, right? You start checking your own experience and analyzing it, and then if you develop a kind of ascertainment, wow, this body. It's not saying it can't be comfortable, right? You can have, in other words, if you're uncomfortable standing and then you finally lay down, there is a moment of comfort, but that's what they're getting at with contaminated or something. It's not pure. It's not a pure comfort. It's a comfort that's relational to a previous discomfort.
It's creating the seeds for another discomfort to come.
Exactly. And do you see how then you start to ask, is there a different, this is the question of the path, right? Is it possible to have what Buddha is asking is, you know, is it possible to be in a state that's free from suffering? And what Buddhism is suggesting is you haven't had that experience yet. I haven't. We haven't had that experience of being free from suffering. We've had the experience of relief from previous discomfort. But what would you see? Do you see how if you practice, you start to go, well, what would that even be like then? Totally unfamiliar, actually, the experience of liberation from suffering. We can't quite imagine that at the beginning. But the four foundations of mindfulness are what allow us to start to imagine that. And you see, going back to your question from earlier, uh, Frank, about like, well, do you practice it before you enter? Actually, you see how now it's like, well, how could you enter the path if you haven't practiced the four foundations of mindfulness? Because it's only by practicing an approximation of them that you start to understand, oh, this is what suffering means, and what would liberation look like, and what is the meaning of liberation. And we'll get to it, there are certain contemplations to actually get at the nature of that noble truth, the truth of cessation. And so as you explore those through your own experience and your own analysis, that's how you would then come to a point of being able to actually practice the actual close places of mindfulness because you went into the path through that process, if that makes sense. Does that sort of more deeply answer that question? And to me, then that's like really interesting, isn't it? And you know, also like I hope you're starting to get the sense of it. These are like a humongous, like they're not just something where you go, okay, we go to a week of retreat on the four foundations of mindfulness and how that was interesting. They're really like a process of how you of a way of a certain way of approaching life or existence, right? Where you're analyzing your own experience in order to understand it correctly and then staying mindful of that. And you see the difference between that and just say like somebody who again it is a practice of mindfulness. It's good, but I hope you start to get also a sense of like, being mindful of your breathing, for example. If that's all you're doing, that's good. It's fine. It's calming. But this is like there what did I say it right? It's so rich. It's like, wow, mindfulness of breathing can be a mindfulness of impermanence. Mindfulness of breathing can be a way of calming the mind. Mindfulness of breathing can be a way of understanding the truth of suffering, the truth of all different kinds of truths about the nature of existence. Does that make sense? But it depends on what you're bringing your intelligence, your wisdom towards. And it's up to you. But there are a lot. And to me, what last thing I'll say on the dedication, but is to me, part of what's really interesting about the four foundations of mindfulness is, if you understand them some, it gives you all these options of what to like be mindful of, or what to focus on, or what to look at, or what to discern. And then it's up to you what you use of them. But that's what there are, is like an opportunity to be aware of and be mindful of, and it's discern about all different kinds of things in relation to the Four Noble Truths and in relation to your own experience of your body, your feelings, your mind, and your phenomenon. A phenomenon in this context means all kinds of things, but mostly means your own mental states. Does that make sense? Those are the most important phenomena, or your own states of mind, which are different than mind. Mind is here as awareness, and then phenomenon is all kinds of things, but it's particularly the different states of your mind. Your anger, your love, your fear, your whatever, like that. But next time, it is next week, we have another class, so we'll go more deeply into the four foundations. I just want to, I don't know how much we've covered today, but I think it's good we slow down. And I think we'll just keep also doing some practice like that of applying each of the four foundations so that people can kind of have a, hopefully you can get a correct understanding of them, but also a sense of how you practice them. And I guess, yeah, so do dedication. The supreme jewel bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you, the source of good and happiness, all powerful Chinrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. And dedicate all these merits, which are merely labeled totally empty from the own side, so the I, who is merely labeled and totally empty from its own side, may achieve Buddha's enlightenment, which is merely labeled totally empty from its own side, in order to lead all sentient beings, merely labeled totally empty from their own side, to the state of enlightenment as quickly as possible. And through this, may everyone in person and online, may we be able to actually practice the four foundations of mindfulness in order to progress, to the level of practicing the path and then along the path to enlightenment as quickly as possible.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Lynn.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Lauren.
The camera's here, so I was waving there. It's not working.
Thank you, Lauren.